Please go ahead. Thanks very much. So about a month ago when I started preparing the presentation, I had a look at the agenda and I had a moment of horror because it struck me that there was not a single person working in the pharmaceutical industry that was speaking. So could I just get a show of hands? How many people are actually working in the pharma industry? So, okay, not many. Excellent. So what I wanted to focus my presentation on today is, I think we operate in a world, because this is an IP pan-industry IP conference, I just wanted to highlight the fact that, number one, it probably comes as no surprise to you that the healthcare or the pharmaceutical industry is probably the most regulated industries. So you can imagine that intellectual property or strategies for protecting your IP might also involve a lot of regulation. So that was one thing. The second thing is that there's a continuous dance between the innovators, for example, the industry that I represent, and the generics industry. And so, just as a side story, one of the jobs I have at Ironwood is to give kind of orientation presentation for new hires. And one of the things we point out is that patents is basically a contract between the government and the innovators, right? So this is a means by which, from the perspective of the government, you get public disclosure of new technologies, new inventions, and in exchange for disclosing this, the innovator, the inventor, gets limited monopoly for, in this case, 20-year term. So it's an incentive for the government to get new technology out in the open, but in the healthcare industry, there are additional incentives that governments provide for providing drugs that are, life-saving drugs. So what I wanted to do was, oh, wait, I gotta start with a disclaimer. So just wanted to let this is something that my lawyers have to, told me that the opinions that I'm expressing today are my opinion, mine only, and not, they don't reflect the views of my employers. So, all right. I will begin with this is probably a slide very similar to what you've seen for other industries, but this is actually the sales for Plavix, a statin that was highly, highly successful by Johnson & Johnson. And you can see that they were chugging along, making revenue somewhere around $2 billion a year, and then suddenly, I think we all know what happens here is that the patent expires, okay? So this this has a huge impact on the revenue on the part of Johnson & Johnson, and obviously you can imagine that this was the time that generics entered the market. I spent a lot of time just talking and babbling, but what I wanted to talk to you today was just to give you a very, very brief review of how a drug gets developed from discovery to commercialization. And then I wanted to touch upon several unique aspects in protecting pharmaceuticals. These are something that is unique to our industry, I believe. Patent term extensions. Also understand that there are multiple exclusivities, not just IP exclusivity that protects your drug against generics. And then it's important to appreciate that there are drastically different markets depending on the type of drug that you're providing. And then, so ultimately, there are considerations when formulating an IP strategy. It's number one, this is probably very obvious, but you should know your product inside and out. And understand your market and understand also how it's evolving. Okay, so for those of you who are in this field, I apologize. This is going to be a very silly review, but just wanted to give a very quick overview of how a drug comes to the market. There are basically several phases. One is what's called the preclinical. So this is a stage before it enters human clinical trials. At this stage, you might initially conduct a drug screen, hoping to find a drug with a certain activity. Afterwards, okay, great, you've discovered it. Then you conduct tests in animals. So preclinical pharmacology, preclinical safety, only at that point do you have enough information to prepare an initial new drug application, or IND as it's called in the United States. And then if the FDA agrees, you can enter what's called the clinical, or some people call it the regulatory phase. At which point you'll conduct phase 1 trial for measuring safety only, phase 2, and then phase 3, what is often called a registrational trial. This is kind of a prelude to what you think is going to be the commercial dose and the patients that you want to treat. And all this comes together. You submit an approval, application for approval, or a new drug application. And the FDA will spend about a year reviewing it. And if you are so lucky, then you will get to commercialization. And this is the point at which you start making money. So what I wanted to point out was that, number one, it's very expensive and very risky to develop a new drug. So the average cost of developing a drug all the way to approval can cost about $1 billion. Okay? So there's a huge component of risk involved on the part of the innovators. The second thing I wanted to point out is that obviously by the time you enter clinical trials at this point, okay, it's usually best to have your patent application filed, because this becomes a point at which public disclosure is something that you cannot control as well. So in other words, if you have to file at the latest before the phase 1 trial, you can see that there's a huge gap between the time of the patent filing and the time of your ultimate commercialization when you start to make money. Okay? In this case, I've drawn it such that there's about a 6-year gap in the quote-unquote regulatory delay between the patent filing and the actual commercialization. Okay? So, yeah, so this is something to keep in mind. And so I think at this point it's probably good to give you a basic review of what a generic drug is. Okay? A generic manufacturer basically sidesteps a lot of these requirements because they're not required to conduct extensive clinical trials to demonstrate safety and efficacy of a drug. And I neglected to say, but clinical trials, in that $1 billion, clinical trials account for the majority of the total expenses. So instead, a generic drug manufacturer seeks approval by demonstrating that their drug is basically the same as the drug that's already on the market. So in other words, they have to demonstrate that they have the same active drug, the same dosage form, whether it's a tablet or a capsule or what have you, and strength. Okay, it's 100 milligrams or 50 milligrams. And you also have to do a quick bioequivalence study to basically say the drug is getting to the same place at the same rate. You know? So if you can demonstrate this, then I must say I'm focusing on the FDA and the US-centric laws here, then you can get the drug, a generic drug can get approved without conducting the same kind of clinical trials that the innovator had to do. And you can understand that from a government's perspective, you don't want the innovator to be making drugs at the premium prices forever, right? So they want, there's also a bargain that's being struck between the government and generic manufacturers, and also ultimately the innovator pharmaceutical industry. And so in essence, what this means is that the generic manufacturer relies on the clinical trial data obtained during the approval of the original or the brand name drug. So as I'll talk about in just a minute, access to this data is actually crucial for a generic drug to get approved. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay, good. So the first thing I wanted to cover that's unique, I believe, to the pharmaceutical industry is that many of the major market countries have a concept called patent term extensions. Remember, I told you before that you have to file your patent here and you only start reaping the benefits of it here, and there's a huge gap, sometimes 6 years. I think actually the average might be 7 or 8 years. So what many governments allow is the restoration of patent term that was lost during the clinical trial period and the subsequent review of marketing authorization application by, in this case, the FDA. So what they do is that, okay, well, if you take the clinical trial period and there's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, this is what they call the testing period, the time that the innovator actually has under their control. And then subsequently, there's a period of agency review. Okay? So usually the FDA takes about 1 year to review this. What they do is like, well, the part of the time that's under the innovator's control, we'll give you for every year, we'll give you half a year. Okay? So in the United States, you can get up to 5 years of additional patent term, which is added to the back end of your patent term, so that they give you credit for 50% of the testing period, and then 100% of the time that the FDA is sitting on the application. So in this scenario, where you have 5 years of testing, 1 year of agency review, they'll give you half of this, 2.5 years, plus 1 year, they'll give you 3.5 years of additional patent term. Okay? So similar rules exist in the major markets, so this is something to be aware of. So that's one thing. I mentioned to you that there are other exclusivities, and this is another series of incentives that governments employ to encourage companies to develop drugs. So there's something called a data exclusivity. I touched upon this earlier, that in order for a generic to gain entrance into the market, they basically need to show that their drug is identical to the drug for which there is already clinical data. So what the government does is that they provide a period of data exclusivity. So it prevents generics from using the innovator's clinical data to gain approval for their generics. In the US, they decided to make it even more complicated. So they have 2 different classes of drugs. So if it's a small molecule drug, then they give you 5 years of exclusivity. If it's a large molecule or a biologic, such as an antibody, which you spoke about earlier today, then you have 12 years of exclusivity. The idea being that the biologics manufacturers probably had stronger lobbyists, but it's also a more complicated molecule to develop and more expensive. Europe, it doesn't distinguish between the kind of molecule. You essentially get 10 years. Another kind of exclusivity is what's called an orphan exclusivity. So this was another way by the governments to encourage developing therapies for diseases that only affect few people. So these are often called rare genetic disorders, rare diseases. It doesn't have to be limited to genetic disorders, but the government's thinking is that if the Pfizers and the Novartises of the world focus their attention exclusively on the drugs or the diseases that affect millions of people, then there's going to be a lot of diseases which are going to be underserved because it doesn't make financial sense for them to develop drugs for them. So the incentive that they came up with is the orphan exclusivity. So US, Europe, and I believe also Japan, Australia, some other jurisdictions have this where if you are the first company to come up with a drug that treats a disease that they define as rare, so in the United States it's a disease that affects fewer than 200,000 people, then they will actually give you 7 years of 7 years of market exclusivity, which means that no market approval for the same active ingredient and the same indication. So this is actually another powerful way that pharmaceutical companies can enjoy additional exclusivity that's completely independent of IP. And finally, there's a thing called pediatric exclusivity. So I think the US FDA and the European Medicines Agency consider it very important for certain indications for pharmaceutical companies to extend the initial approval so that it covers, that they test to see whether it can work in younger patients. So they give you another incentive. If you conduct studies in the younger population and it's shown to be effective, and so on and so on, they will give you a 6-month additional market or patent exclusivity in exchange for conducting those clinical trials. So yeah, I mean, I for one, being a parent, I'm very thankful that there are certain drugs that have been tested to see whether it works in children, so that, you know, and that's something that pharmaceutical companies probably would be otherwise not very motivated to conduct these studies. So in addition to patents, what we have is in the pharmaceutical world is you can actually have a situation where there are multiple exclusivities protecting your drug against generic entry. So that's what I wanted to point out in this slide. And a common term of art, I'm sure this is familiar to you all, but LOE, as compared to LOL, loss of exclusivity, and it's the last to expire of the patent, regulatory, or other orphan exclusivities. So you can see how intertwined they are and how it's important to keep these other things in mind when you draft your patent applications. So I have to say that working at a pharmaceutical company, the regulatory folks have become very, very, very close friends of mine, so we talk often. So the other thing to appreciate is that I'm covering a huge swath of pharmaceuticals in my conversation topic, but what I wanted to point out is that you need to understand your market. There are drugs that are hideously expensive. This one, Solaris, is a rare disease treatment. So they have worldwide, I think last time I checked it was about 3,700 patients worldwide, but their annual drug cost is about $700,000 a year. It's very expensive. So that's what you have on one extreme of the spectrum. On the other hand, you have things like vaccines or cardiovascular drugs or immunology. And what I wanted to point out was that there's a huge spectrum in terms of costs and in terms of the number of patients it treats. Okay? So I think this is one thing that you need to keep in mind when you decide how to protect your drug with a patent. And I think the other thing that obviously one needs to consider is what is the global pharmaceutical sales? It's like, what are the biggest markets? So obviously the US is very, it's the largest by far in gross sales, global gross pharmaceutical sales, excuse me. China has recently skyrocketed to be number 2, and Japan, Germany, et cetera, et cetera. But I think, as you saw before, there are some therapeutics that are very expensive. So if you look at the global pharmaceutical sales on a per capita basis, the dynamics changes quite substantially. So now US still remains number 1, but number 2 now becomes Switzerland. So I think that's also something to keep in mind, is how expensive is the drug that you're hoping to sell. Another thing is that, diseases, we think of it blindly, but actually that's quite untrue. So there are drugs that are meant for treating diseases that have vastly different prevalences. And so this is data taken from the World Health Organization. This is just a color chart for prevalence of HIV. You can see that certain territories are highlighted more. But then when you look at other indications, you see almost a total opposite. So this is for inflammatory bowel disease, and you can see the prevalence is completely different. So I think that's another way of saying you really need to understand your market. This was obviously another important consideration is patent costs, and I think this is probably something everybody's well aware. But what I tried to capture here is the size of the pharmaceutical market. This is in descending order, and we were very thankful that CPA Global provided us with some estimates for IP expenses. The great thing is that for European applications, there's a lot of patent costs have been, at least translation costs have been significantly reduced thanks to the London Agreement. So this actually helps a lot. But one strategy has been to consider, well, what if we just take the top 8 market? I mean, notwithstanding the fact that there can be huge differences in the prevalence or the cost. But if you just took a swath, you can see that the big 5 countries within Europe actually constitute the second half of this group. So a very quick and dirty approach that one can use to cover the pharmaceutical market as much as you can in a cost-efficient way is to go for US, EP, Japan, China, and then if you do that, it'll cover about 62% of the global market, notwithstanding those subtle differences. And the nice way of doing this, looks like I have a, sorry, that was a transfer mistake. The nice thing is that if, at a certain point when you know that your drug is going to be successful, you have the option of pursuing other European countries as well at the validation stage. So obviously, file where you plan to sell. You obviously want to file to block competitor activity, protect where, in addition to where it might be sold, you may want to protect where generics are likely to be made. If it's a patent related to technology or methods, ask yourself where these are likely to be performed. And there's a number of other considerations, such as the possibility of parallel importation. In terms of expenses, are there possibilities of getting synergies in terms of translation costs? What is the level of drug price control? The ability to enforce patents in those jurisdictions? And finally, that the world pharmaceutical market is rapidly changing. And this is actually an illustration of how the world pharmaceutical market was in 2003 compared to what is projected to be in 2020. And you can see that there are massive, massive tectonic shifts going on, where China went from number 9 to number 2. And there's a lot of other countries that are rapidly rising or descending. So I think that's basically, I believe that was my last slide. But yeah, thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this was helpful.